Hey, how's it going? It's James Miller here for VFX Nomad, and today I wanted to take you through a default project. Now, this is my setup, this is what I use, and I give it to you to look at. Now, most of the places that I've worked at have something along these lines, and most people's setup that I've looked at have something along these lines, and it just seems to make sense. You can obviously set this up however you want, but I think this is probably going to be a decent starting point and help you sort of make sense of how the program works a little bit, because it's obviously so open at the beginning, which is cool and can also be confusing. So here's the project. Now, what I want to do is I'm just going to open new so I get exactly the same as what you get. All right, so we're going to get something like this. And the first thing that I want to concentrate on here is the library. So in essence, it's broken into two sort of top level things. We have the shot itself, which we'll come to. But before that, we have the library. Now in Clarisse, as you're probably aware, you bring things in, and then once they're set up, you add combiners to them, and then you populate your scenes. So even if that's not too familiar with you, hopefully this will make sense. So to begin with, what we're going to do is go through how to build an asset. So the library is basically where we're going to have all of our assets. So if you had building A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then you had road 1, 2, 3 and cars 1, 2, 3 or whatever, you put them all in here. Okay, you don't necessarily put them in per shot. And the reason for that is, if we switch to the 3D view and I just look at example 1 for a second, here we go. Now this has gone black because it's probably in the wrong mode. Yeah, it was in progressive, so we're going to turn it back to previs. And what we've got here is we have these 3 balls. So example 1, what's it doing? First things first, we have our geometry folder. Let's look inside the geometry folder. This is where the 3 balls are, right? So you can move them, you can do whatever you want. And below that, we have our material folder. So that's where the materials for these balls are here, and then the balls themselves are here. Right, pretty straightforward. Here we have this thing called a group, and the group is using this rule. And it says anything in this geometry folder, add it to the group. And we can check that really quick by just copying and pasting these guys and looking at the group itself. Okay, so I've copied and pasted them. Here they are. I'm going to move them. We now have 6 balls. Okay, so I didn't have to do anything else. It just updated itself, which is great. Now that group has to go somewhere, it has to live in something. So this is where the combiner comes in. At the bottom of the combiner, you'll see that I'm just looking at that group. Again, you don't plug the balls directly into the combiner because you want to use that rule. So the other advantage of that rule is if you're referencing stuff in, it'll constantly update whatever was in that reference. So if you added a door or got rid of a window or whatever, just makes your life easier. I would advise doing it. Okay, and then the last thing is the shading layer here. So let's open the shading layer editor. Shading layers, got another videos on that, which hopefully explains it. But what it in essence does is it says, hey, this ball equals this material. So it just says this equals this, or the other way around. Okay, and it keeps those relationships. So when we're ready, we can grab the shading layer and look at it. And that's what this little window here does. And we're in previs mode, so it's pseudo lighting, so we can take a look at it. And then we're just gonna look at the whole example folder and go, okay, cool, this asset works. Which is great. So then we just repeat the process with any other assets that we're going to use, whatever they are, car 1, 2, 3. In this case, I have 3 boxes. And so here we have box 1, 2, 3. We have the materials. Again, the same kind of things happening. We have a group. The group's looking at anything in the geo folder. That's then being fed into a combiner. And then the last thing that we have is the same shading layer. Now, we notice that these are gray, right? And if I drag and drop that in, then great. Now I can look at this one. But the problem is right now I can look at either example 2 or I can look at example 1, right? I don't have the ability with one shading layer to see both, right? So there's this nifty little thing that you can do with shading layers where you can nest them. So here under the project level, we have this thing called the master shading layer. What you do is I'm just going to start over, but what you can do is you can say add, and we go into our library and we say, hey, example 1 has a shading layer, and we add that. And then we can say, oh, example 2 also has a shading layer, and we can add that. So we're not actually populating any rules here itself. And what that allows us to do then is, as we move forward, if we remember when we bring in assets to add them to the master shading layer, we can just leave the master shading layer up here. And what that means then is, as we go between example 1 and example 2, our materials still go to where they're supposed to go. All right. So hopefully that was relatively straightforward. You just continue to put examples in here. That's the gist of it. So moving on to the shot. The shot lives in its own folder, ultimately because you can copy and paste shots, which I'll try and do at the end. But let's have a look at how this thing's set up. The first thing you have is this render me context. The render me context, unsurprisingly, is where we put things that we wish to render. So let's look at the render me context. And then we're going to go, into our shot, and we say, hey, I want to render this combiner. So we drop that in there. And then you say, oh, I also want to render these cubes. So you drop that in there. Now we can just move that out of the way. Now you see these 3 cubes are locked together because we're just doing the combiner, which is what we wanted. And we can still see everything because we're looking at the master shading layer, which is cool. And hopefully our shot will be looking at it as well. But again, we'll come to that in just a moment. Now, the other thing that's in this render me folder is a lighting folder. Lighting folder is where your lights go. Now, the reason that they're nested together is so that if you want to look at the render me folder like this, but you also want to see how it's working with your lighting, you can now switch to progressive. And progressive will work because we're looking at everything in this render me folder, which includes the lights. So at this point, if you were lighting and you wanted to just lighten the 3D viewport, you can. And you can get this interactive shenanigans going, right? Some people don't like having the render folder and the lighting folder in the same place, and therefore they'll make a group that looks at the 2 different things, and then you put that in there. I find that kind of cumbersome, so my personal preference is to just sort of stack them like this. Okay, so we have our shot. Our shot has our render me folder and our lighting folder, so we've got those 2. The next part might be blank. It is in this particular instance. It's a material that is like shot specific. So if you're using chrome balls, I tend to put the materials in here and I tend to put the geometry in here. Okay, these are things that no one else is going to be using except for this one particular shot. So in this instance, we could literally delete those 2 folders. They're not doing anything. And then after that, we have our shot cam. So our shot cam is for shot 01 only, right? No other shot's going to use the same shot cam, I would think. So there we go. We have all of our shot specific stuff now in one folder. And that's kind of it, really. And so we have our image, which sits here, and our image is looking at the beauty. And then just to go over how the beauty is set up, it's all relatively straightforward. So it's looking at shot 1's camera, and we know where that is because we were just looking at it. It's looking at its ray tracer, which is also just sitting right next to it. And then everything is looking at this render group, right? Because we're just looking at the beauty. So everything's looking at this render group right here. And this render group is just saying, hey, everything in this folder. And that's like a super lazy, easy, quick way to make things work, right? So the only one that's different here is this lighting one. This lighting one, we probably, like, I'm not going to confuse us by leaving it with the render one, but here it's just looking specifically at this lighting group, which is here. So this is how we utilize groups, and we get away with it. So obviously, as you're doing more complicated stuff, like making different layers for different things, this could change in what's in what folder, but it's definitely a good place to get started, and this will help you out. Now, the one thing that I did mention was the master shading layer. So if we come down here to the bottom, and you'll see that it says shading layer, and we've just plugged in our master one, right? So what we're getting at this point is anything we see in the 3D viewport should be the same as how the renderer sees it at the end of the day. And we can check all of that. There's a neat shortcut. If you want it, click on your camera, you press L. And at this point, I actually undid my camera. So let me just do that again. You can tell here because of the eyedropper. So I'm gonna press L, eyedropper turns on. This is what we're looking at. I'm gonna click on my image view, and this is what I'm getting. And it's easy enough. I can press Alt and I can recompose and I can move things around. And then if I wanted to, I could be like, hey, I wanna do whatever with my light bulb, and then off you go, right? So it's pretty simple. And it's kind of efficient, right? Now, I did mention shot one. Now this is like kind of an added bonus of doing it this way, which I like. And what you can do is you can go over and you can grab shot one, you can copy it and you can paste it, right? So now we have shot two. Ideally, you would be doing this because you want like the same shot, but you want a different camera, you know, for example. Now, I'm not going to sort of go super into that, but what I wanted to show you, which I thought was kind of cool, and I still think is kind of cool, is if we look at shot two, everything looks identical, right? And the thing is here, so let me just change some things so that it's clear that this is a different shot. And what I wanted to say was, let me just rename this because that'll get confusing, is we copy and pasted this. And if you think about it, you might assume that that means that those groups that things are looking at, it's still looking at shot one, right? But what's super clever is that it's clever. And what it does is updates those for you. So even the camera, if we actually click this arrow and we look at which camera it's looking at the one that we just duplicated. And that is true for all of these groups as well. And we have a look and it's in shot two's group. It's not looking to shot one. So it's smart and allows you to quickly iterate your shots, or I shouldn't say iterate, set up your shots. So yeah, I mean, if you're deploying like the same set multiple times, you don't need to be concerned about this because ultimately our library is where the assets are. The asset only exists once in the library. So by duplicating the shot over and over, you're not actually making the scene any heavier. You're just creating more combiners, right? So, so you can set up your shot once in shot one, and then for the rest of the sequence, you could duplicate that, swap the camera out, and then do any tweaks on a per shot level, but you're in essence getting that duplication for free. But yeah, so that's kind of how I like to work, and I find it very easy. And sort of a last thing to note is I haven't set up any AOVs in here, but you can just sort of click on your motion vector or whatever it is that you want, and you can add that to your beauty here, and you can set it off. So I think I'm going to leave the default project there. I'll probably delete this shot two business and just leave it as is. But yeah, if you have any questions, just throw them in the notes below, or if there's anything you want me to go over, then just let me know. But hopefully that helps, and enjoy the project.